What's up, U.S. history kids? Mr. Tomei here, coming at you with another video. We're getting closer and closer to the present day. We will be there in about a month. Today's video, we're getting close to the end of the Cold War here. We're going to be talking about U.S. history during the 70s, talk about some of the big events, cultural, societal changes that are happening in the 70s, talk a little bit about disco, right? Your homework assignment will have you listen to some disco music. All right, team, let's get into it. The 70s. So America in the 70s is at a crossroads. It's a nation that has come off the tumultuous heels of the 60s decade that was traumatic, depressing in a lot of ways, and very, very turbulent. So we were kind of figuring out about who we were, what we wanted to be, where we were going. And a lot of art, media, music kind of reflected that. The legacy kind of the hippie movement compounded with an America kind of looking to get away with the problems of the 60s led to art, music, fashion becoming, in a way, almost like an escapist type mentality. Sci-fi was very big because of the moon landing. Star Wars, one of the biggest films to come out during the 70s, and other kind of like Star Treks were very popular and whatnot. Disco music was very popular. It's very disco. You either love it or you hate it. There is no in between, I feel like. And then fashion was large, loud, and colorful, similar to the 60s, but the 70s was much more about getting back to wearing like more like traditional clothing wear, like at least, you know, pants and shirts, and but just matching everything together. The disco ball and the colors, and it was all about going out and dancing at the disco clubs. But again, the 70s, it was all about the 60s was the 60s. Let's go and create this new escape from reality world of the 70s and listen to some uplifting music or watch movies about sci-fi and get away from the problems of America. Disco. The golden age, people. Let's go back to that. TV and video games kind of went through a big growth movement as well. There became a lot more like television shows, a lot more programming, more video games, right? The home entertainment system, right? Like Atari, Pong, right? The early days of video games. And so this would kind of lay the groundwork for the future of how we consume TV and how we consume video games and like what people do for entertainment at home. So those are some of the social things that are happening in America. But let's talk more about some of the American policy and political issues that were going on. So I told you before about Richard Nixon. He had some character and integrity flaws, and that would be his downfall. Well, that gets us to the Watergate scandal, which happened in 1972. So this all has to do with the lead up to the 1972 election. Nixon is up for re-election, and the country was really divided coming out of the 60s, right? Pro-war, anti-war, you know, pro-civil rights movement, anti-civil rights movements. People were in their camps, very divided. Nixon, being very paranoid, the paranoid human he was, he sent a team to break in to the Democratic National Committee's headquarters at the Watergate Hotel and set up secret microphones to listen in on the conversations and the strategies that the Democrats had, because Nixon, being the Republican, he wanted to know how to win re-election, and he was just paranoid, right? But the problem is you can't do that, right? As the president, that's an abuse of your power. And so, you know, he was going to get in trouble for this. The team got caught, and eventually the investigation led back to the White House. Some journalists were doing really a lot of work, and they were starting to piece some things together. And so this investigation took time, and Nixon was able to bury the story long enough to where he actually won re-election in June. But the news broke broke open in 1974, so about a year, 2 years after the election. And he was facing at this point certain impeachment. You know, the people, the American public and politicians were like, you completely abused your power. You were paranoid. And I mean, you can't do that as the president. So instead of being impeached and removed from office, um, Nixon resigned, kind of in disgrace. He kind of wanted to go out on his own terms. Um, but the legacy of this scandal is very important. The issues we see today with fake news, not trusting the political elites of DC, it stems from Nixon's abuse of power, how he went about it, how he lied for years. And it's had a long-lasting effect on American political life. It's created an atmosphere of cynical beliefs towards politics, and oh, they don't do anything, and you know, the idea of like being betrayed and distrusting the government. You know, some people take that to the next level, which is like what QAnon has become and other things like that. Drain the swamp. You've probably maybe heard of that in the news. A lot of that happens because of Nixon and the Watergate scandal. And so Nixon to this day is seen as probably the worst president of all time, just for how, you know, poorly he handled just the integrity of the office, right? When you are the leader of a country, and the accountability that you need to have. He failed at that. And his legacy will always kind of be shrouded in negativity and darkness, and generally is a unfavorable, poor president when we rank them. So yeah, the Watergate scandal, pretty big. That's the facility where it happened, at the Watergate Hotel. The paper in the next day, Nixon resigns. The guy on the right is Gerald Ford. The vice president, he would take over for Nixon. We'll talk about him in a second. And then that's Nixon to the left there leaving. The famous picture of him leaving on Marine One, that helicopter that transports the president. Trying to go out in grace, but again, Nixon was pretty hated and disliked. Nixon lived pretty much the rest of his life kind of as an outcast as an American former president. You know, tried to help out and be a statesman, but no one really wanted to be affiliated with him. So he kind of died, and there was little pomp and circumstance. There was little, mourning that really happened for a former president. But he did it to himself. He was too paranoid. Couldn't win fair and square. That leads us to the Gerald Ford presidency. He was president for a short time. He takes over for Nixon. He actually ended up pardoning Nixon because Nixon was, going to face some penalty for breaking federal crimes. And so, Gerald Ford, right, pardons him, kind of as maybe a thank you for, hey, you picked me as your vice president, some loyalty. That kind of hurt his legacy too. His presidency is short-lived. It's relatively unremarkable. Nothing insanely good happens during his presidency. And his connection to Nixon, especially when he pardoned Nixon, really hurt his chances of winning the election in 76. And fun fact, he's actually the only president to never have won an election. Every other president has at least ran and won an election. Ford is the only one to have never have won an election. So his presidency is brief, unremarkable, but just so you know about him. Other things in the 70s that are going on, there's a lot of economic issues in the 70s. We talked about this with the Vietnam War, but years of overspending eventually caught up with us, and it came back to really hurt us. When you spend a lot of money on war, you don't have money for other things. And if an economic crisis were to happen, it's harder to give relief to aid the American public, and that makes things worse. So there were a lot of issues like economically in the countries in the 70s. On top of this, there was a couple oil embargoes, which we're about to talk to, that led to some international energy crises that affected America, especially in the 70s. And so these energy crises were the result of two major oil shortages one in 1973 and then one in 1979 that had drastic effects on the American economy and gas supply. In both instances, Middle Eastern countries interrupted or paused their supply of oil to a lot of the US or US allied nations. Um, Part of it has to do with the United States' support of Israel as a country in certain efforts of trying to give them independence or supporting them in war. A lot of the Middle Eastern countries who are not cool with Israel didn't like that, and they cut off oil from us. So gas prices became like $10 to the gallon, which in the 70s is insane, right? The most I've ever seen in my lifetime might have been like $5. So yeah, $10 back in the 70s, insane. There's also just a lot of lines. Gas places were closed, they didn't have gas. People would wait 30, 40 minutes just for gas. The second oil shortage happened in 79, which was an event that corresponds with the Iranian Revolution. The revolution there, again, the people that took power were not pro-US, so they didn't want to send us oil. And so again, with the economic crisis plus this, tough time in the 70s economically for our country. After Ford, the guy who takes over for Ford, the guy who wins election, is President Carter. Fun fact, this dude is still alive today. He's quite old, but yet he is still alive. He's a Democrat from Georgia. He's probably best known for his role in acting as a peacemaker, even during presidency, but in the years after, in a lot of international conflicts. He had inherited a country with a low morale and a bad economy. It was kind of like rebuilding in a lot of ways from a lot of scraps. He wasn't really able to get much things done in his presidency to kind of turn America around, per se. A lot of that's not his fault, but when you're the president, if you can't get things done, you're not always going to last very long. He's generally regarded as a below average president because he wasn't able to get a lot done. Again, he was a one-term president, but he was good. He's considered as a generally good person. And he's still alive today. We're getting to the point where presidents are still alive. We're getting closer and closer. The thing that really doomed Carter, among other things of not being able to get things done for the economy, was the Iranian hostage crisis, which we're going to talk about. So in 1979, Iran went through a revolution. And this revolution has lasting impacts to this day. And it turned Iran into an autocratic theocracy. Essentially what that means, it became a country that became extremely conservative and was ruled by religious law. Very strict, very to the teachings of the Quran or whatever the leaders of those countries, how they interpreted, Islamic law and what they wanted to institute. And this new Iranian government leadership, they didn't really like the US because we supported the old leader who wasn't much better of a leader, but he was chill with us. So he gave us like oil. And so we supported him, but he was a bad leader and he was pretty oppressive to his people. So that kind of came around to bite us. And then eventually this really came to a head on November 4th, 1979. This was kind of a few months into the whole revolution. And at this point, there was a lot of anti-American sentiment, and we still had an embassy in the capital city, which is known as Tehran. And so a lot of Iranian civilians, mostly students and some militarized students or groups, they stormed the U.S. embassy in the capital city of Iran, Tehran, and they took 52 American hostages. The hostages were held captive for 444 days before being released. Carter was never able to get them released before the election, which might have played well for him, right? People might have been like, oh, he did something, but it didn't happen until after the election, and that really doomed him. The big thing that the new Iranian leadership wanted is they wanted us to give up the old leader who was exiled and fled. And we could have done that, but had he gone home, he would have been killed. So that was kind of the negotiation point. And of course, this led to like the oil shortage, and this led to a lot of other issues that we still feel today. These are just some pictures of the hostages on the upper left, the storming of the embassy, the bottom left. And then there's a movie about this called Argo. It's got Ben Affleck, a couple other people you might know. It's actually a pretty good movie. Um, you can find it on like HBO or Amazon. Even it might even be on Netflix. This movie came out 6, 7, 8 years ago, but it's pretty good. It tells the story of a secret mission to get a few American embassy workers who did not get taken hostage, and they were hiding out in the capital city of Tehran. Talks about how we were able to bring a few of them back home. They were cool, pretty crazy secret mission. So you should watch it. It's a good movie. And here's kind of the legacy of the Iranian hostage crisis. We do not have a great relationship with Iran. We have not really had any real relationship with them that hasn't been confrontational since the revolution. I mean, you can just see the pictures here. The pictures to the right are people in the street ripping up the American flag. This picture in the upper left, this was, I think, from last year. I don't know if you remember. Iran was really in the news. There was like the World War III memes and stuff because we took out one of their military leaders. And so in response, there was a lot of renewed hate towards the Americans, and they burnt this, like the politicians in Iran burning like an American flag, like in their Capitol kind of building and stuff. And of course, we do not really look at Iranians the same way very well, right? You see the sign of deport all Iranians, and there was a lot of, especially during the hostage crisis, a lot of hatred towards like Iranian Americans. And to this day, we've had very confrontational issues with them. Each side sees each other as oppressive and cruel. The other thing that really makes it complicated is Iran has intent to build nuclear weapons, which has probably made our relationship with them much worse over the past 20 years. And it's tough. We could really dive into the geopolitical landscape of the Middle East and our relationship with Iran and who supports Iran and how does that affect us. But it's an issue to keep an eye on going forward. So, and I believe that's the last slide. Okay, team. That's it. Make sure you do your homework, and I'll talk to you later.